across the country. A national conversation.
It truly is a movement. It is not a moment.
Outrage over police brutality spilling into the streets.
A reckoning with racial injustice.
I gotta ask you to stand down.
And promises for change.
Where does Alabama fit into the efforts to shape the future? What can we all learn?
Tonight, a CBS 42 listening tour with local leaders on race and policing. We hear you. Protesters, police, clergy, and local leaders are all talking about race. It matters what's being said and what's being heard. Welcome to our CBS 42 special report, Race and Policing, We Hear You. Good evening, I'm Sherry Jackson.
I'm Jack Broyer. Tonight we're launching a CBS 42 listening tour of our community to learn about the intersection of race and policing and how it impacts who we are as a society. Here's tonight's agenda: how Birmingham's historic civil rights past informs today's struggle, law enforcement and civil rights. What do we have and what do we need? Policing tactics and George Floyd's death, what has changed, and the role of the church, how the faith community can address racial injustice.
And joining us now to bring some perspective and, of course, answer your questions is our panel who's all agreed to join us tonight. Retired federal judge UW Clemon, Jefferson County District Attorney Danny Carr, Pastor Eva Melton of the Firm Foundation Church, Birmingham Police Chief Patrick Smith, and Reverend Katie Gilbert with First United Methodist Church. And also joining us live from the Birmingham Police, from the FBI Birmingham Division headquarters is Special Agent in Charge Johnny Sharp. And we want to begin by asking all of our panelists, and we will start with you, SAC Sharp, about why you decided to be a part of this CBS 42 panel. Why did you accept the invitation?
Sure. Well, thanks, Sherry, and good evening and to all your viewers, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in your panel this evening. So when you extended the invitation to me to represent the men and women of the FBI's Birmingham Division and be a part of this panel, I thought it was very important for me to do so and accept your invitation, because for well over a decade now, in partnership with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, the FBI has led a community dialogue on civil rights and policing through our annual conference on civil rights and law enforcement, usually held every September, kicks off typically on a Sunday at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and is followed up by a couple of days of presentations at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. So that, coupled with the fact that ever since the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the FBI has been the primary or lead federal agency when it comes to investigating criminal violations of federal civil rights statutes, and more recently with the passage of federal hate crime statutes, the FBI leads the effort investigating those types of crimes as well. So given everything that's going on across our nation today over the past few weeks, particularly since the George Floyd incident and the dialogue that you're wanting to have, I thought it was important to give the FBI's viewpoint, because we do play a major role in establishing that dialogue and working between the community and with the community, which is who we serve, in trying to bridge that gap and make sure justice is served where warranted when it relates to federal civil rights and hate crime violations.
SAC Sharp, thank you. And so we want to pose that same question to all of our other panelists tonight. And we'll start at the top left with you. That's where you are located, Judge Clemon. Why did you decide to be a part of this panel?
Well, 63 years ago, when I was 13, I witnessed an incident of police brutality, which led me that very day to decide to become a lawyer. When I was a student at Miles, I participated in the demonstrations in 63, but prior to that in 62, when the students had this selective buying campaign against downtown stores. After I became a lawyer in 1979, a Birmingham police officer shot an innocent black woman in the back of the head, killed her, Bonita Carter, and I represented the family. So I have been involved with the police more or less all of my life. And therefore it was and unhesitating decision on my part to be a part of this panel.
Judge Clement, thank you. And DA Danny Carr, let me ask you that same question. We have this sort of perspective on law enforcement. Why did you accept the invite?
Well, let me first say thank you for having me, and thank you for putting together this esteemed panel. One specific factor for me is that these conversations now are long overdue. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, and I agree with some of the people that talked about that this is not just a moment, that this is a movement. And being a part of this movement means that you have to be willing to be a part of the conversation. And I understand the importance and the significance as it relates to the role that I'm playing as an African-American DA. And I recognize the fact that I stand on the shoulders of men like Judge U.W. Clemens and other men that have paved the way for me. So I want to be a part of the solution so we can eradicate the problem, and being a part of conversations like this, in my opinion, are very important right now.
And so I'm gonna split on the faith community really quick so that I could hear from Police Chief Patrick Smith, because a lot of this centers around what's happening with police. And so you accepted our invite readily, Chief Smith. Can you just weigh in?
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for including me in the conversation. I think it's tremendously important that the community knows that we're listening, we hear you. And when I took over as chief of police, the very first thing that I wanted to do was to listen and let everyone know that many of the things that people are asking for in the various communities, we've already started to implement here in Birmingham. Many of the policies that people are fighting for, we've already implemented here in Birmingham. And it's always been incredibly important to me to be a part of the solution and not perpetuate a problem. And I want the community to know that this Birmingham Police Department represents you. We want to work with you. And the most important thing is that we're listening, and we want to be a part of the solution for everyone.
And here at CBS 42, thank you, Chief Smith, we feel like it involves all of our community. And so, Pastor Eva, let's talk a little bit about the work the Firm Foundation is doing in the community, but specifically why you wanted to bring that work, your activism, to this panel.
Right. So thank you for convening us on tonight. I believe that God is on the side of justice. And the issue of policing is a racial justice issue. And I believe that it's important that the faith leaders and the faith community get racial justice right in the present climate. It is an opportune time for us to tell the truth about the past, the present, and the future. And so I do a lot of work with activists in the community, but especially around podcasting and media. And I think it is expedient for all of us to get the word out, but also bring the necessary people to the conversation so that accountability can take place.
Reverend Katie Gilbert, your sentence on why you wanted to be a part of the panel. You just accepted the invite too.
Absolutely. Thank you for extending the invitation. At First Church, one of our previous pastors was a recipient of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And so I joined the conversation because we believe that we have to do better. We believe that God is always calling us to cry out when there are systems of oppression and injustice. And we believe that God is calling us to use our prophetic imaginations to enact a different reality.
Okay, and so to all of our panelists, I want to say thank you for joining us. We wondered how we could draw on Birmingham's rich civil rights history to better understand what's going on today. And we stumbled across the words of a civil rights giant in our city.
Yeah, back from 1966, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights wrote the Birmingham Manifesto. The opening sentence of that one-page letter reads like this: "The patience of an oppressed people cannot endure forever." It goes on to say the oppressed in Birmingham have hoped in vain for some evidence of good faith resolutions to our just grievances.
It's been 50 years. Those grievances, as it seems, against racial inequality have persisted. And so, Judge Clement, I want to start this question just with you. Why do you believe, here we are 50 years later, but that sentence from Reverend Shuttlesworth still sounds true? The patience has grown thin.
Well, actually, Reverend Shuttlesworth started much much sooner than that. In '56, in fact, when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded. And at that time, Birmingham was one of the worst cities in the nation in terms of police brutality, because the Birmingham Police Department was headed by Eugene Bull Connor, the commissioner. Actually, we have made tremendous progress in the last 50 years, as evident by the fact that the police chief is now one who looks like me. And the police officers, many of them, are Black and are aware that when they perform their duties and confront citizens, if they realize that the persons that they are confronting are their brothers and sisters and cousins and friends,
So
they are much less likely to violently react than they would if they were a person of the color and of a racially biased mind.
So let me say this, Judge Clement, the protesters today that we've seen, they want these remedies to what they see as police departments who are violating their civil rights and in some cases getting away with that. The Department of Justice is just one place to report the misconduct, although the Department of Justice itself has its own sordid history with civil rights in America.
Right, but just last week, the DOJ unveiled the Civil Rights Reporting Portal, saying it's an online tool that in theory makes it easier for people to report civil rights violations. Here's U.S. Attorney Jay Town on the DOJ's new one-stop shop for reporting those violations.
It's important that every citizen understands how important the Department of Justice takes any violation of civil rights or any perceived violation of civil rights.
Those violations could, of course, include misconduct by law enforcement, hate crimes, or human trafficking. They can all be reported at civilrights.justice.gov.
Special Agent in Charge Johnny Sharp Jr., we want to talk about police brutality, or what the FBI calls the color of law. So when do these violations, some of what we've seen in the news, become a federal hate crime? When does it become something that raises to your level on brutality?
Sure. So, well, you talked about, Sherry, the color of law stuff. So it's actually two different categories within the civil rights program that the FBI investigates. So color of law being one of them, hate crimes being another. So I'll just start with color of law. So color of law is the investigation of civil rights violations, criminal violations of civil rights when it involves a person in authority. So in this instance, or as we saw in a case of George Floyd in Minneapolis, where you have a law enforcement officer using force that everyone watching the video can determine is excessive and not needed to effect the arrest. So in those particular instances, when we're made aware of instances of excessive force or police officers taking individual civil liberties from them without being a lawful arrest, we can initiate an investigation and to go in and independently determine whether or not excessive force was used. We gather those facts through the course of interviews, through video coverage, body cam coverage, if that exists. We then present those facts to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then they make the determination of whether or not they'll be charged moving forward with a criminal violation. So again, the FBI's role in all this is the fact finders, being the investigators, and the U.S. Attorney's Office are the ones who prosecute the case.
Which is important information. Following those nationwide protests, in just 1 second, over George Floyd's death, we want to talk a little bit about that because some states really moved quickly to enact new police reform laws.
In fact, the Marshall Project has been tracking those changes over the last month. They've looked at legislative action on reform. Some of the changes like banning chokeholds, eliminating no-knock warrants, and no longer shielding misconduct reports from the public. States like Iowa, Colorado, and New York all have new laws on the books. 13 other bills have been introduced, and President Trump signed an executive order that, among other changes, would create a national use of force database operated by the Attorney General's office.
Some of the other things that have come out of the calls and the protests have been these calls to defund police. That is certainly that has raised a lot of eyebrows with people. And so, Chief Smith, I want to talk to you because when you hear that, when you hear people say defund police departments, we understand that some of that means reallocate the money. But what is it you hear and what is it you'd like to say to protesters on that?
Well, first I want to go back to just the total conversation of where this actually came from. This came out of Minneapolis, where they were talking about defunding the police department, and it carried throughout the nation. I want to point out just one bit of fact from my research on this total issue and how it applies to Birmingham. In a comparison with Minneapolis Police Department, the budget for the Minneapolis Police Department in 2020 was $193 million, okay? And of that, they had 892 sworn and 175 non-sworn. The Birmingham Police Department, however, operates on more than $101 million less than that. Whereas we have, we're allocated 905 sworn and 181 non-sworn. So we already have a budget that's $100 million less than that of Minneapolis. So when you say defund, I would already tell you that we've already been defunded, if you want to use that. But the way I look at it is I think that we need to look at how we're doing our training and what we need to do to accomplish the goals and missions that they're moving towards. And that is to make sure that within the budgets of the police department, that there is an allocation in there for specific training, such as de-escalation training, such as implicit bias training, and a number of other trainings for law enforcement that will achieve the overall goal of where we're trying to go to make sure that when someone comes out, they have received the appropriate training to handle the circumstance, situation, specifically even as it relates to total use of force training.
Chief Smith, 1 second, and for the panel, we need to take a quick break because we don't have a lot of time here. We're going to take this commercial break and come back and finish this conversation.
Yeah, when we come back, the protests that haven't fallen on deaf ears, how some of the business community have responded with their own message of equality.
And that includes NASCAR. The organization banned Confederate flags from their properties this month. How the fans reacted, you see.
And when that 115-year-old Confederate monument came down in Lynn Park, the group of white churches raising thousands of dollars in a matter of hours to take it down.
Race and policing, we hear you, continues after this.
You're watching Race and Policing. We hear you.
After a peaceful protest turned violent in Birmingham with fires and destruction of property on May 31st, Protesters first took down the statue of Charles Lynn in Kelly Ingram Park, then moved to Lynn Park to attempt to bring down the Confederate Sailors and Soldiers Memorial Monument. The next day, Mayor Woodfin removed the statue, which stood for over 100 years. A group calling themselves White Clergy for Black Lives raised more than $50,000 in a matter of hours with the goal of taking down that monument. And Reverend Katie Gilbert, First United Methodist Church, you guys were a part of that effort. So let me ask you why this group was formed and what their primary purpose was in doing this act.
Absolutely. So First Church is located right in downtown Birmingham, only 2 or 3 blocks away from Lynn Park. And so we had a staff meeting that next Monday. And as the staff, we said, gosh, what is something that we could do that would make an impact? And somebody threw out this idea of, it's going to cost to take that monument down. And all of a sudden we realized there was a need. And so we reached out to some of our other clergy. We felt strongly that that was a monument that white people put up and that honored white people. And so we felt very strongly that white people should be the ones to pay to take that down, that should not be coming out of our city's budget. That there were enough people who felt strongly about that coming down that we felt like we could get the support. So we were in contact with the mayor's office. A church member of ours works out there, and he indicated that we needed to move quickly. And that is exactly what we did. We reached out to our fellow clergy, and we got the GoFundMe up, and it just took off from there.
Over $60,000. They in fact had to shut it down, and the rest of that money going to a group called Faith in Action. For every action, though, we know there is a reaction, and in some places, more Confederate monuments came down after that event. Yeah, then NASCAR took it one step further. Shortly after monuments started coming down, NASCAR announcing back on June the 10th it would ban the Confederate flag at all of its properties. That at the urging of the sport's only full-time African-American driver, Bubba Wallace.
This was a move that needed to happen a while ago for sure, but I was proud of the efforts by NASCAR.
And on the CBS 42 News at 5, we brought you the breaking news that rope fashioned as a noose hanging in the number 43 garage was assigned to Wallace before the noose was found, of course, so it had been there since 2019. The FBI now saying that their investigation of possible hate crimes this afternoon found that no crime was in fact committed.
SAC Sharp, what can you tell us about that investigation, but more importantly, about the terror that a noose creates for African Americans? It is a symbol of hate.
Yeah, absolutely, Sherry. So our office was notified Sunday evening by NASCAR upon the discovery of what appeared to be a rope fashioned into a noose in the bay that Mr. Wallace's vehicle was assigned to. So we took that matter very seriously, as we would any incident, and we surged resources down to Talladega. So I actually had 15 of my special agents travel down yesterday to conduct a number of interviews with NASCAR personnel. And through those interviews, we were made aware of the fact that the last time that bay was used was in a race held in Talladega in October of 2019. We were told who was given that particular bay assignment, and through an exhaustive search of social media, video, YouTube, stuff that was provided, we were able to find video footage, which was confirmed in terms of being, in terms of its authenticity by NASCAR. And we were able to determine that the rope that appeared to be a noose was hanging from the garage door. It was actually used as a garage door pull as early as October of 2019. So the bay assignments aren't made by NASCAR until days before the race. It's based upon the point standing of the individual drivers. So one could conclude no one knew at the time in October of 2019 that bay would be assigned to Mr. Wallace and his team this past weekend.
So I just want to get real quick on hate. I don't want to cut you off. We're running out of time, and I want to give Pastor Eva a chance to talk about this part about hate and hate crimes, what motivates them. We know that was not a hate crime, and everybody is relieved that resolved the way it did. But Pastor Eva, can you talk a little bit about the church's role in helping people overcome hate with love?
I think that hate is something that is taught and that we have to see our neighbor not just from a one-to-one standpoint of how I treat you, how you treat me, but we must also look at systems, policies, and laws and see our neighbors from a broader standpoint, and how we interact in the public square matters as well, not just one-to-one interaction. I believe that we must tell the truth about the past, the present, and our history to even have a starting point to even address hate and implicit bias, because of many of these crimes that are happening, many of the targeting by the police is because of a person's implicit bias. And so we have to deal with that individually, but we must also look at hate and how we deal with our neighbor from a broader standpoint.
Let me do this because we are running out of time here on air. This conversation is continuing at CBS42.com and on our Facebook page in just a moment. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being a part of this moment. If you have some time, we do want you to stay on with us. We have another couple of guests joining us, but we have something that we'd like to close this program with right now. So hang on, panelists. Thank you to all of our viewers.
As Sherry mentioned, the conversation continues at CBS42.com and on our CBS 42 Facebook page coming up in just a few minutes.
And now this, again, just the beginning of the discussion. So go ahead, weigh in with us. Our hashtag right now is We Hear You. You can go to CBS42.com and send us your information or post it on our Facebook page.
For now, we thank you for joining us on air. Don't forget, go to CBS42.com for more of this conversation. I'm Jack Royer.
And I'm Sherry Jackson. This is a CBS 42 special report, Race and Policing. We hear you.
Rodney King.
Rodney King.
Mayless Green.
Mayless Green.
Abner Lamoy.
Abner Lamoy.
Abdo Deleo.
Abdo Deleo.
Sean Bale.
Sean Bale.
Oscar Grant.
Oscar Grant.
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin.
Eric Gardner.
Eric Gardner.
Michael Brown.
Michael Brown.
Tamar Rice.
Tamar Rice.
Laquan McDaniel.
Laquan McDaniel.
Walter Scott.
Walter Scott.
CBS 42 News presents Race and Policing. We hear you.
So we're going to continue this conversation, and we broke off on air talking about love conquering hate. And I want to go to you, Judge Clement, to talk about in the 60s and when you were growing up and making decisions about what you wanted to do in the area of the law, the type of hate that existed then, how do you compare that to some of the hate crimes and some of the atrocities we hear about today?
Well, until the recent revolution in the streets, many of the attitudes had not changed. I must say this now that I have the opportunity to say it. The most important thing to do is to vote every chance you get, at whatever cost. Because only putting the right people in office is going to change things. President Trump is against you. The Department of Justice is against you. The Attorney General of the state is against you. And the only way to bring about those kinds of changes is to vote. And it is very reassuring to see so many of our white brothers and sisters taking the lead nationwide to bring about the kinds of changes that we think are about to come forward.
Some people have talked about sort of reimagining the systems that we have in place. And so for you, Chief Smith, and also for you, SAC Sharp, the systems that we have in place, do we have the tools in place in the institutions that exist now to move them in the direction that the protesters want?
So I guess, Sherry, I will start off there. So from an FBI standpoint, absolutely, we think we have the tools necessary in terms of the legislation that has been passed through Congress with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and then recent hate crime legislation that's been passed. From a legislative standpoint, the FBI has the tools it needs to investigate those matters and present them to the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution. So civil rights is a priority program for the FBI, and it's something that really only the FBI does. So we take our role very seriously. And as you could see in the incident we had in Talladega, whenever we're made aware of an incident like that, we surge resources that to quickly get to the bottom of it. And we would have done that even if it had never received any media coverage, if we weren't under the current climate we were in, right? Throughout my 22-year career with the FBI, we've had similar type instances, and the FBI has always responded in kind, where we surge resources to aggressively pursue, obtain the facts, and present that to the U.S. Attorney to make a prosecutable determination. So, at least from my viewpoint, the FBI has what it needs to investigate those types of matters and assist the public.
Chief Smith, what about Birmingham Police? I know you guys released that accountability report, and you moved with swift haste to get that out to the public. Do you have what you need when when the public says and protesters say they want policing to be reformed in such a way?
You know, the thing is that we always have to keep the doors open to possibility and always have to listen to what the public says. We, the police department, we have to be a part of the community, and the community also a part of the police department. But the most important thing is, I want to point out is that there are a lot of police departments out there who have done the hard work to make sure that we're meeting a lot of the expectations of the community. You know, like here, we don't do a chokehold. We don't even teach our officers to do a chokehold on anyone. And if they were to use that, it would be an out of policy thing. We teach de-escalation. We have a duty to intervene. We have a use of force continuum. We have comprehensive reporting. We teach implicit bias, procedural justice training. There are a lot of things and a lot of police departments who have already implemented a number of things and are trying to do the hard work to make sure that we're meeting the goals of the community. And, you know, I have to point out that, you know, even the day before there was unrest in the city of Birmingham, what did you have the Birmingham Police Department doing the day before? We were doing a food drive. We were giving away food to a number of families in the community, and that was our second one, where we were able to provide food for over 1,500 families in the two food drives that we had. So I think we have a great opportunity here in Birmingham to turn the civil rights thing around, to whereas we have an opportunity with folks listening, with law enforcement ready to work with you, and ready to do the work necessary to make sure that we're meeting the goals of the community.
And so I want to get, we have two new panelists who've joined us, Carter McGinnis, the pastor of Mountaintop Community Church, and also Birmingham City Council President William Parker. And so Councilor Parker, and also Michelle Clement, who is an attorney who is working specifically with athletes as they develop social platforms. And so we will get into the discussion of really what happens when athletes raise the level of discussion, as Bubba Wallace did, as LeBron James has done, and certainly as Colin Kaepernick has done. And so, Councilor Parker, you have obviously recently been in the news for the move for Black Lives Matter Boulevard. We've seen the big mural on the street there. Your response to the community conversation that is happening in the city now, you obviously grew up here, a second-generation servant of the city. What is your reflection on what's happening in this moment, in this movement in America, more importantly in Birmingham? So we're having a mute problem. You have to push your mute button there. Pastor McGinnis, thank you for joining us. Mountaintop Community Church just last night held an event bringing the community together, bringing people of color and your congregation for a discussion. Can you tell us why you decided to do that and what your next steps are?
Yeah, it was a really great night, and we wanted to start with our church family. We're blessed to be a diverse church. And we wanted to listen to how everyone was feeling, how everyone was experiencing, and just me as a white pastor, very interested to just listen to my Black brothers and sisters of how they are experiencing life as an African American in America, and especially the last 3 or 4 weeks. Our kind of theme was love, listen, learn, and lead. That we want to come to the table first because we love each other. God commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. That was one of Jesus's top 2 commands. And then to listen. If we're going to love, we need to listen. And sometimes when we listen, we want to form our next sentence first. And we just said, we just want to listen and sit with people's experiences who have been different than ours. And sometimes that's painful to hear what people have gone through that are different than us. And then what can we learn from that we didn't know? The question I kept asking our African American members is, what do I not even know that what do I not even not know that I don't know? And then where do we go from here to lead? And so we started with a platform conversation last night, and then so next week at 6:30 we'll be hosting kind of a follow-up where we'll be inviting everyone to be around tables to talk socially distanced, but so that everyone can be involved in those conversations. We believe that the church has a unique perspective. If we're commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves, we ought to be better at this than anybody. And our hope is that we can kind of be a light to the community when we're out in the world.
Counselor Parker, if you have that mute button working, can you weigh in? I like, Pastor Carter, what you said about, the church leading out front on this. Counselor Parker?
I agree. On Friday, we had a march on Friday with their pastors throughout the city of Birmingham. As we marched from City Hall in Park to Kelly Ingram Park, the March for Justice. And so I think it symbolizes all of us working together to make sure we can bring change. This is going to take us working elected officials, working with our community stakeholders, our activists, our community leaders as well, and also working through all the media. It's going to take all of us working together to bring about this positive change.
And it does seem that a lot of people are willing to come to the table. And so, Michelle Clement, let's talk about that, because a lot of athletes are using their platforms, supporting one another, professional athletes, but even college athletes are standing up and calling out what they believe is, some of it is discrimination, and some of it is, hey, if you're with that particular publication, I'm thinking of the football player in, I think it was Ohio, or was it Oklahoma? But do you know which one I'm talking about? But
yes, Oklahoma State. Yes.
Oklahoma State. So just using the platform that you have, because I think we all get the opportunity to bloom where we're planted, but blooming in this discussion, how important is that for the young athletes?
I think it's tremendously important. We're talking about this in the context of race, but you have to think of it in terms of these athletes, really these Black athletes confronting 2 pandemics at once. And I think that the COVID piece has helped kind of inform their approach to activism, to racial social justice. By way of example, Power 5 conferences stand to lose around $4.1 billion if the football season doesn't go forward, right? And because the athletes have awareness of that, they realize the leverage they have. So it's been really great to see student athletes in this season assert their voices. You have the young, the football player, I cannot recall his name, at Mississippi State, who's saying, as long as that flag flies with the Confederate emblem on it, I'm not playing. And I'm not sure that happens absent the athletes getting a sense, frankly, through COVID, of how much value they bring financially. It's incredibly important that they find their voices, and I'm proud of how they're doing it. Obviously, professional athletes have more leverage. They have unions. They have more financial stability. And so it's really incredible to see how the student athletes have brought themselves to this social justice piece in this time.
And so this idea of community working together, in that when people say, hey, this is a problem, that it's not so much an us versus them as much as it is, let's have this conversation. I want to go to the other members of the clergy who are on the panel to talk about that. It's been said that Sunday mornings in America are the most segregated hour. In the faith communities, are we starting to see more of a diverse congregation, whether it's a large church or a small church, or are we still pretty much in our corners by way of race? Oh, Pastor Eva.
Pastor Eva, you go ahead.
We'll start with you, Pastor Eva.
Well, we're not in a post-racial society, and so that's going to be reflected in the church. And until the field is level for Black and brown people, I don't think we should be expecting or looking for the church to reflect that.
Pastor Carter?
Yeah, so it's hard work, right? I mean, it's easy to get in our camps, and because diversity takes intentionality, it takes difficult conversations, it takes repentance. So that's really the angle that we come to it. Long before I got to Mountaintop, we had already become a diverse church. We're really proud of that, but we know we have a long way to go. Like, we're all a work in progress. So for us, the word intentional, it keeps coming, is we want to be intentional about creating diverse voices at the table, in leadership, in staffing. Gosh, sometimes even when we create a social media post for our church, if we run it by different people from different backgrounds to say, hey, how does this sound to you? Does this communicate what we're saying? So we're just really trying to get out of our own echo chamber and listen to other voices and create more voices at the table. And that just takes intentional hard work and continued conversation.
And so that beauty of diversity, and this I'm going to go back into law enforcement on what we're seeing in the ranks. Reverend Katie, let you weigh in though on the church and diversity.
Sure. Well, I think they said that beautifully, that I think we are still pretty segregated at that 11 o'clock hour. I will say I have participated in, and I know many other local clergy have, Faith in Action Alabama, which is a multiracial effort, multi-faith group of people. And that is one of the best spaces that I have seen clergy, for sure, coming together, Black and white, to the table to say, what are we doing together to end systemic racism in our state and in our cities? There are 4 different hubs. But I did want to make sure we recognize that work. While our congregations are still pretty segregated, and I think we all hope and dream for the day when they're not, there are many clergy coming together to work together.
And let's get into the diversity question for law enforcement on our panel. And I just want to ask you, Chief Smith, because Judge Clemens said that, when he was growing up and they were fighting the Bull Connors of the world, there weren't people that looked like you in that position. And so he considers that a success. But what about the rank and file? Do you feel that the Birmingham Police Department is one that is diverse? And is that diversity up the ranks?
Yes, right now I think the department is pretty well diverse. We are approximately 70%, I would say, African American. We mirror the community that we serve. And so I think if you were to search this department, you will see tremendous diversity throughout.
SAC Sharp, you're here with us, and that is a question for the FBI. Do you all have the type of diversity that you think is reflective of the community? Are there efforts to create more diversity in your ranks?
FBI's had a concerted effort over a number of years where we want to be reflective of the community we serve. So I think the FBI is fairly diverse, but we could certainly do a lot better. And so to that effort, our recruiting teams, our human resources teams, to include mine here in the Birmingham division, have had a concerted effort to try to recruit at historically black colleges, recruiting females, specifically because the numbers of female special agents throughout the FBI aren't where we would like them to be. So we are working really hard, and we've seen a positive impact on our recruiting efforts in that the ranks of our special agent cadre, which is about 13 special agents strong across the whole FBI, and the organization as a whole, which is comprised of about 38,000 employees globally, is starting to become more and more reflective of the nation that we serve. So we recognize diversity is a key piece to building the trust with the community we serve and getting the diverse numbers that we want within our ranks, particularly at the special agent level.
Judge Clement, let me go back to you because you applauded seeing Chief Smith here, and he's talked about these numbers, but you sat on the bench for some time. What do you make of the numbers when people talk about the judicial system of the incarceration of African Americans? What is
well? It's painfully clear that blacks are overrepresented when it comes to the incarcerated persons in our society, and grossly underrepresented in the law enforcement ranks. The Birmingham Police Department is the exception. There are a few blacks in the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. So a lot remains to be done, and the leadership has to come from the top, and it comes down to the vote. We need to put in office leaders who will steer us in the direction of equality, and it looks like a lot of our white brothers and sisters are determined to see that happens, and that is all important, because it will only happen when their votes put the right people in places of power and position and leadership.
So today, the Associated Press and Newark did a poll that showed that the majority of Americans want to see some policing reform. And so I want to pose this question to our panelists, because you guys represent our community here, and just ask each of you, in regards to reform in policing, do you recognize what people say they want to see, and why that is? I'll start down here at the bottom on my screen. Michelle, that will be you, and then we'll go over to Carter, and then you, Councilor Parker, and then Katie, and we'll just zigzag all the way to Chief Smith and Pastor Eva, and then you, Judge Clement. So Michelle, go ahead.
Sure. So I want to make sure I understand the question. Do we recognize what the community is asking for?
The need for police reform.
Absolutely. I recognize it. In the context of the work that I do, it's important for student athletes and professional athletes in particular, because these are the communities from which they come, and these are the communities in which they live. For me personally, I am fortunate enough not to have had a negative encounter with police, but countless friends of mine and family members of mine have. So I absolutely understand the need, and am sympathetic and am in favor of reform.
And so, Pastor Carter, if that question is presented to you from a pollster, you know, is there a need for police reform? Are you hearing and understanding what protesters are saying?
Yeah, I certainly understand, and just the stories that I'm listening to, just so grateful for Chief Smith and all the men and women like him who really dedicated their lives to our safety. And I think, and I know that in this season they've gone through a tough time as well. And yet at the same time, I also listen to stories to particularly my black brothers at our church, who have had much different experiences than I have, who have been, pulled over. One of the stories told last night by one of our young men, who's just a a counselor in our school system near us, but who was pulled over for doing nothing, was given a body search, taken out of his car, things that have never happened to me. So I listened to that, and what I really believe is that it changes in relationship. And I think as we learn to talk to each other, and as we begin to see each other as not just strangers, but as we learn to hear people from different sides and see everyone as we come at it from faith as image bearers, then we don't see people as threats on either side, but we see how we can serve and make our community better. So I hope that there can be a way where we can build relationships and communication and conversation, because I think that's where all our reform takes place.
Councilor Parker?
Yes, I obviously see a need for reform, but I think what we need to do is allow Chief Smith and the mayor to do their 30-day review, and then they'll come back and meet with council and also meet with community stakeholders as we move forward. And I think what you'll see in Birmingham is everyone working together. I think you'll see the police chief, the mayor, city council working with activists, community leaders, having these to strengthen our relationship. And I think we'll be a model that other cities will look at over the country. So I think you'll see a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation as we move forward in that sense. But we want to allow the chief to continue his due diligence and report back after the 30-day review period.
And so people are able to look at that accountability report. Reverend Katie, you said you guys reached out to the city. You saw what was going on. And so that partnership with the faith community and the city as the broader community, when you look at what you hear from the public on people asking for reform, what are your thoughts?
Yes, we absolutely see the need for there to be reform, and there's no denying police brutality towards people of color. And we at First Church have a close relationship with a sergeant here in Birmingham who is also a Black man, and we have partnered with him. I mean, he has texted us multiple times when the protests were happening, helping us keep an eye on our property, and when things got scary one day downtown, advising us on whether or not we should stay or leave. And we think that communities should always have the opportunity to evaluate those systems that are a part of their everyday life. And whether that be policing, sometimes it's other things. And we think that that's an important next step in the process.
Chief Smith, for you and for the members of the Birmingham law for the police department, for all of them, how has this affected sort of, you don't wear the uniform 24/7, so the emotional state for them with this dialogue going on?
Well, the thing is about law enforcement is that you have to recognize that you serve the public, and every day of the week you serve the public. And so I look back to the time that I was a child. I think I represent reform. I didn't have role models in this position to look to or to try to help. As I constantly tell our officers, we have to be a part of the public. We have to work with the public, and we have to work and do our job to serve them. And that is why we have protect and serve, but also added respect, because we have to respect the public. And so I hope that the citizens of Birmingham know that we are here for them. We are listening, and we want to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And I think that if you look, you mentioned our accountability report, go back to it. We've been working a long time down this road to make sure that we have accountability on this police department, that we're working with the community on everything that we do.
And that looks the transparency of that is pretty good. Before we let you go, Special Agent Sharp, because you're on here, let me get you to weigh in on that. I don't know if the FBI can say, yes, I think there needs to be police reform, but please speak to the time, and you kind of mentioned it during our 6:30 hour, but can you speak to the need for reform, what you're hearing from the public?
Well, obviously, there's been a huge outcry nationally as a result of the George Floyd incident, right? And understandably so. Anyone would be horrified who watched that video that took place for nearly 9 minutes there. But in terms of overall police reform, that's going to be left up to individual police departments and municipalities and their respective elected officials working in concert with their communities. And that's part of why we're having the dialogue we're having tonight, correct? You know, but having this conversation, having this dialogue, and letting the public share with the police and their elected officials what the issues are as they perceive them. And the police department, in turn, needs to listen. And Chief Smith is a outstanding individual, utmost law enforcement professional in a position to do that, and I think that's evidence in his statements here tonight. So while I can't weigh on specifically on overall police reform, obviously there is a huge outcry, and the public is who we serve. And so if any municipality out there doesn't heed or listen to what their community is saying, well then that really doesn't behoove them to try to make the situation better and look forward to see how we can improve relations, because law enforcement has to have the trust of the people in order to do the job that we're required to do, and that's protect our community.
SAC Sharp, thank you. We're going to let you sign off. I'm going to come back over here, Pastor Eva, because we're getting down to the end of the wire, and I just want you to weigh in on that last question.
Right. I think all of us know that the community is saying that something has to change, even in Birmingham. Birmingham is spending $92 million a year on community policing. And so if we are still having the same amount of murders or homicides each year, we know something has to change. A large part of Defund the Police is saying, hey, police should not be responding to mental health cases. They should focus on crimes and criminals. They're not social workers. They're not medical professionals. And so some of those funds can be used to fund people who are not armed. San Francisco just enacted policies that says, hey, unarmed professionals will go if it's not a violent crime taking place. And so we want to see something happen, not just tomorrow, but very quickly before we see one of these incidents happen again in Birmingham.
And so this will be my last question, and Judge Clement, we're going to allow that to go to you on the close on your reflection, what you've seen, what you see in this moment, and when it comes to police reform and what happens today versus what happened in the 60s when you were coming of age. What are your closing thoughts that we could take away on how Birmingham as a community that has this rich civil rights history could potentially be another model for America?
Well, taking all things in turn, it's fair to say that we've already made tremendous progress here in Birmingham and rest of the state. But there is such a long way to go. Like, for example, as a retired federal judge, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there are no black appellate judges in the state of Alabama. None on the Supreme Court, none on the Court of Civil or Criminal Appeals. Only one active black federal judge in the state. And so we've got, I think, a great challenge ahead of us. But with the mindset of the people of all races that I see now, I think we're going to do so much better in the future.
Judge U.W. Clement, I want to thank everyone on the panel, Judge Clement, Pastor Eva Melton, Chief Patrick Smith, and you, Reverend Katie Gilbert, Counselor William Parker, our council president, Pastor Carter McInnes, and you as well, Michelle Clement, and those other guests who were with us, DA Danny Carr, who was with us earlier tonight. We want to thank all of you for participating. What CBS 42 hopes to do is launch a virtual listening tour where we will be able to bring people in the community together, various communities, to talk about the issue of race in a format and in a way that allows people to hear one another. And so thank all of you for joining us. This conversation, of course, will continue. It's on CBS42.com. And so you're watching there right now. Please post your comments, your questions, and who knows, what you say may be what launches our next conversation.